An elderly African-American woman was confronted by police officers on her own porch, but the moment her son arrived, her attitude changed dramatically. Cleopatra Sinclair, a 78-year-old woman with silver hair and kind eyes that sparkled with the wisdom of decades, sat on her porch in Ireland, Georgia. Her hands, worn from years of hard work, gently rocked the chair as she looked out at the street, her home for more than 50 years. Born in the segregated South of the 1940s, Cleopatra had lived through the tumultuous civil rights era, raising her family amid the fight for equality. She had marched alongside Dr. Esquire, braved water hoses, and faced down police dogs, all while instilling in her children the values of perseverance, dignity, and education as a path to a brighter future. Of all her life's accomplishments, none brought her more pride than her son, Oren Senla. Against overwhelming odds, Oren had risen from humble beginnings to become one of Georgia's most respected judges. By age 50, he was known for his unwavering commitment to justice, his ability to see beyond racial and socioeconomic barriers in his courtroom. Despite his accomplishments, Oren never lost sight of his roots. Every Sunday he visited his mother, bringing food and spending hours absorbing her stories, each a source of wisdom. Cleopatra, in turn, kept his childhood bedroom intact, a shrine to the dreams she had nurtured in her only son. The Copat neighborhood had changed over the years. The once tight black community had gradually been replaced by new, mostly white families. With them came renovation projects and skyrocketing property values. Cleopatra watched these changes with a mix of curiosity and concern. Always welcoming, she greeted new neighbors with a smile, though she remained attentive to the shifting dynamics. Through it all, Cleopatra remained a pillar of the community.
Hello, sorry to interrupt. If you're liking the story, so please subscribe to my channel. My goal is to hit 1,000 subscribers in 30 days. Please support me and hit the subscribe and like button. Thank you so much.
She volunteered at the local church, tended her small garden, sharing her harvest with neighbors, and always offered a kind word or a home-cooked meal to anyone in need. Her house, though worn and aged, stood as a testament to a bygone era, surrounded by newly renovated homes. That afternoon, Cleopatra sat with a glass of sweet tea in hand, quietly observing the world around her. She greeted Mrs. Burnett, a new neighbor walking her dog. Cleopatra couldn't help but notice how Mrs. Burnett quickened her pace as she passed her house, gripping her purse tighter. Cleopatra sighed, burdened by the familiar weight of a life filled with such encounters. Yet she straightened her back, lifted her chin, and continued to rock gently in her chair. She had endured worse. What Cleopatra didn't know was that her resilience would soon be tested once again. The peace of that quiet afternoon was shattered by the shrill wail of police sirens. Her calm crumbled as two patrol cars barreled down the street, stopping dead in front of Ms. Burnett's home just 3 doors away. Cleopatra's heart began to pound, memories of past run-ins with police flooding her mind. From her porch, she watched as 3 officers, 2 white men and a Hispanic woman, emerged from their vehicles, hands near their guns as they approached Ms. Burnett, who was gesturing frantically in her yard. Straining to listen, Cleopatra caught snippets of the conversation, something about a suspicious person, and one who didn't belong. A chill ran down her spine as Ms. Burnett pointed directly toward Cleopatra's home. Before she could fully comprehend what was occurring, the officers began walking toward her porch. Cleopatra gripped the arms of her rocking chair, willing her hands to stop shaking as she prepared for what was to come. "Ma'am," the commanding officer, a burly man with short hair and icy eyes, spoke as he approached. "We've received a report of suspicious activity in the area. Would you mind if we asked you a few questions?" Cleopatra sat up straighter in her chair, summoning the dignity that had sustained her through countless encounters over the years. "Of course not, officer," she replied, her voice steady and calm. Though fear bubbled within her, Cleopatra maintained her composure. "I don't know how I could help you, officers. I've been sitting here all afternoon enjoying the quiet." The younger, seemingly more empathetic officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, a resident reported seeing someone matching your description lurking around the neighborhood and watching." You've been sitting out the windows. Could you please tell us where you've been for the last hour?" Cleopatra's eyes widened in disbelief. "Young lady, I've been sitting on this porch since after lunch. I haven't moved from this spot, much less loitered around the neighborhood. At my age, that would be quite an accomplishment." The third officer, who had remained silent until that point, let out a mocking laugh. "Yes, of course. Look, ma'am, we have a witness who says otherwise. Why don't you tell us what you were really doing?" A wave of indignation swelled within Cleopatra. "Young man, I've lived in this house for over 50 years. I have no need or interest in looking in anyone's windows. I am a law-abiding citizen, and I am deeply offended that you would accuse me of any criminal activity." The commanding officer changed his stance, his tone becoming colder. "Listen, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Are you admitting that you were inspecting homes? We can settle this at the station." Cleopatra's hands were shaking, but her voice remained firm. "I have done nothing wrong, and I have no intention of going anywhere with you. If you have any more questions, you can ask them right here on my porch." Frustration grew among the officers as Cleopatra refused to give in to their demands. Her tone became more confrontational, challenging their right to be in the neighborhood and demanding to see proof of residency. "I don't carry identification to sit on my own porch," Cleopatra replied, her patience wearing thin. "My name is Cleopatra Sinclair, and as I said, I have lived here for over half a century. If you don't believe me, check the property records." The commanding officer's face darkened with frustration. "Okay, that's enough. If you don't cooperate, we'll arrest you for obstruction of justice. Stand up slowly and put your hands behind your back." Cleopatra's heart pounded as the gravity of the situation sank in. She thought of her son Orion and the lessons of dignity and resilience he'd always instilled in her. Taking a deep breath, she made her decision. "I won't," she said, her voice firm. "I've done nothing wrong, and I'm not going to be treated like a criminal in my own home. If you want to arrest me, you'll have to physically remove me from this porch, and I assure you I will not go quietly." The officers exchanged bewildered glances, clearly surprised by the elderly woman's fierce resistance. As they gathered to discuss their next move, Cleopatra silently prayed for strength, hoping someone would see what was happening and intervene. Unbeknownst to her, her ordeal was about to take a turn that would send shockwaves through the local police force and have a lasting impact on the entire community. Just as the tension on Cleopatra's porch reached its peak, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. The officers, so engrossed in their confrontation with Cleopatra, barely noticed the new arrival until an authoritative voice broke the air. "What's going on here?" They all turned to see a tall, distinguished man in his mid-50s walking toward the porch, his impeccably tailored suit and demeanor. Her confident expression instantly captured everyone's attention. Cleopatra's face lit up with relief and pride. "Orion," she murmured, her voice shaking. She could barely contain her gratitude. "Thank God you're here." The commanding officer, sensing a change in the situation, stepped forward, his tone still authoritative. "Sir, this is a police matter. I'm going to ask you to stand down." Orion, surveying the scene, saw his mother visibly shaken but resolute, surrounded by police officers on her own property. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but with barely contained anger. "Officer, I'm Judge Orion Senla of the Superior Court of Georgia," he said, pointing at Cleopatra. "And this is my mother. Now, I suggest you explain to me why you're harassing an old lady on her own porch before I start making some phone calls you won't like." The effect of his words was immediate. The officers' faces paled as they realized who they were dealing with. The commanding officer, suddenly nervous, stammered, "We had no idea. We received a report about suspicious activity in the neighborhood." Orion cut him off by raising his hand. "And you automatically assumed that my mother, who has lived here for over 50 years, was the culprit? Based on what evidence exactly?" As the officers scrambled to justify their actions, a group of neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Among them was Mrs. Burnett, now visibly uncomfortable. "And I saw someone I didn't recognize walking around, and with all the new, "You stole them." Orion remained calm, but his tone was sharp. "And this person you saw, did she look anything like my mother?" Mrs. Burnett blushed with embarrassment, casting a hesitant glance at Cleopatra for the first time. I'm not sure. It all happened so fast." Orion turned to the officers, his expression hardening. "Let me get this straight," Orion said, his voice thick with disbelief. "You received a vague report about a suspicious person, and your immediate reaction was to come here and attempt to arrest my mother, a respected citizen of this community, without any real evidence or provocation." The revelation of Cleopatra's identity and her son's status had completely changed the dynamic. The officers, who only moments before seemed secure in their authority, now looked like reprimanded children. The neighbors watched in stunned silence, gradually realizing the gravity of what had almost occurred. Still sitting in her rocking chair, Cleopatra watched the scene with a mix of relief and sadness. Her son's position, and the respect he commanded, had saved her from what could have been a dangerous experience. But the fact that she even needed such protection pained her, a reminder of the prejudices that lingered in her community. As Orion listed the officers' legal and ethical violations, Cleopatra briefly closed her eyes, offering a silent prayer of gratitude for her son's timely arrival. However, her prayer also asked for understanding, healing, and a future where incidents like this were distant memories. The revelation of Cleopatra's true identity and her son's role sparked a confrontation with profound implications. Although the immediate threat had passed, the weight of what had occurred hung heavily upon her. As she watched Orion rebuke the officers, Cleopatra's mind raced through a life of triumphs and struggles. She thought of all the times she had faced discrimination and the obstacles she had overcome to raise her son in a world that often seemed to be against her. She thought of the young men in her community, those who did not have a judge in their family to defend them. In that moment, Cleopatra made a decision that would change not only her own life, but the lives of many others. With the tension still palpable in the air, she turned to her son, her voice soft but firm. "Orion, that's enough." The crowd's attention immediately shifted to her. All eyes followed her as Cleopatra slowly rose from her rocking chair, her posture regal, her back straight and her chin held high. "What happened today is not just about me," she continued, her voice calm but firm. "It's about every single person who looks like me and doesn't have a son in a position of power to defend them. We can't let this go without consequences." Orion looked at his mother, a mix of concern and admiration in his eyes. "What do you want to do, Mom?" he asked. Cleopatra took a deep breath before answering. "I want to file a formal complaint not just against these officers but against the entire department for allowing this kind of behavior. And I want to tell my story, along with the stories of others who have faced the same injustices. It's time for a change. And if I have to be the one to initiate it, then so be it." The repercussions of Cleopatra's decision were immediate and far-reaching. Officers, who already looked uncomfortable, were now visibly distressed at the thought of an official complaint from a judge's mother. The assembled neighbors began murmuring among themselves, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably, unsure how to feel about the brewing conflict. Orion, after a brief moment of reflection, nodded. "If that's what you want, Mom, I'll support you every step of the way. But rest assured, this won't be easy." Cleopatra's eyes sparkled with determination. "I've never shied away from doing the right thing. I'm not going to start now." In the weeks that followed, Cleopatra's decision deeply shook the local community. The formal complaint she filed triggered an internal investigation into the police department, revealing other instances of racial profiling and misconduct. Her story, which began as a local matter, soon gained national attention, becoming a rallying cry for those fighting systemic racism in the police. Despite the grueling effort that the fight entailed for Cleopatra, she found strength in the unconditional support of her son and in the knowledge that she was making a difference. However, not all the consequences were positive. Cleopatra began receiving threatening phone calls and letters from those who saw her actions as an attack on law enforcement. Some of her neighbors, uncomfortable with the attention the case was bringing to the neighborhood, began to distance themselves from her. The police department, feeling the pressure, reacted defensively. They attempted to discredit Cleopatra by bringing to light minor infractions from decades past. But her impeccable reputation, combined with the clear evidence of wrongdoing in her case, only caused these efforts to backfire, further fueling public outrage. True to his word, Orion remained by his mother's side throughout the process. Orion used his connections within the legal community to ensure that Cleopatra's complaint was treated with the seriousness it deserved. He also made sure she had the best legal representation possible. However, his vocal support for his mother's cause began to lead to problems in his professional life. Rumors began to circulate about his impartiality, and some suggested that he should step away from police-related cases. As the weeks turned into months, Cleopatra's case became a catalyst for further conversations about race relations in the community. Town hall meetings were held, bringing together residents, law enforcement, and community leaders to address long-standing issues of discrimination and prejudice. At the center of these discussions, Cleopatra earned the respect of even those who had initially opposed her, due to her quiet dignity and steadfast commitment to justice. In addition to participating in these dialogues, she began working with local youth groups, sharing her experiences and encouraging them to stand up for their rights. At the same time, she sought to build bridges with law enforcement, hoping to foster mutual understanding. However, the stress of her new role as a community activist began to take a toll on both her physical and emotional health. Cleopatra's health began to deteriorate under the weight of the decisions she had made. There were nights when she couldn't sleep, wondering if she had done the right thing, if the loss of her peace and privacy was worth it. But every time she received a letter from a young man thanking her for her bravery, or saw the news of positive changes being implemented in the police department, she was reminded that she was on the right path. The impact of her actions continued to unfold, and Cleopatra often recalled her words to Orion on that fateful day. "It's time for a change, and if I have to be the one to initiate it, then so be it." At the time, she had no idea of the ripple effect her decision would create. As she sat on her porch one late afternoon, looking out at her neighborhood with new eyes, she felt a deeper sense of purpose than ever before. The road ahead would be difficult, but Cleopatra was ready to face it, armed with a lifetime of wisdom and a renewed determination to seek justice, not just for herself, but for her entire community. As Cleopatra's story gained national attention and her fight for justice intensified, a secondary narrative emerged. Officer Zafira Delgado, the young Hispanic woman who was present during Cleopatra's confrontation with the police, was deeply disturbed by the incident. Unlike her colleagues, who rallied to defend their actions, Zafira could not shake the feeling that they had made a grave mistake in the way they treated Cleopatra. Motivated by guilt and a desire for change, she began documenting other instances of racial profiling and misconduct within the department. Zafira kept a detailed journal, recording dates, times, and the names of officers involved in questionable incidents. Although her intentions were noble, she soon found herself in a precarious position within the police force. Meanwhile, Ms. Bernati, the neighbor who had called the police on Cleopatra, was facing her own crisis of conscience. The public backlash against her actions was swift, with many in the community labeling her a racist. Overwhelmed by guilt and seeking redemption, Ms. Bernati reached out to Cleopatra, requesting a meeting to apologize in person. That meeting, initially tense and awkward, became a turning point. Drawing on her vast experience and deep capacity for forgiveness, Cleopatra listened as Ms. Bernati tearfully apologized, sharing her own struggles as a Black woman in America. That conversation marked the beginning of an unlikely friendship, with Ms. Bernati becoming an unexpected ally in Cleopatra's fight for justice. As these personal stories unfolded, the broader community was also experiencing significant changes. Inspired by Cleopatra's courage, activists. The hearings pressured the city council to debate proposals aimed at increasing police accountability. These discussions generated intense disagreements, polarizing the community. Some supported the reforms, while others defended the status quo. Judge Orion Centaur, meanwhile, found himself navigating increasingly turbulent waters. His public support for his mother's cause made him a controversial figure in legal circles. Some of his colleagues privately questioned his impartiality, while others admired his courage. Orion had to carefully balance his personal convictions with his professional responsibilities. The police department, feeling pressure from multiple directions, launched a public relations campaign to try to salvage its image. They held community outreach events and sensitivity training sessions for officers. Many, however, viewed these efforts with skepticism, dismissing them as superficial gestures meant to prevent real change. Meanwhile, the secret log officer Zafira Delgado was compiling continued to grow, filled with ever more detailed accounts of misconduct. Zafira struggled internally over whether or not to expose the truth. Unexpectedly, she found an ally in Judge Centaur. Their connection would prove pivotal in determining whether or not the department would face the full consequences of its actions. Clandestine meetings between Officer Delgado and Judge Sinclair, rife with legal and ethical implications, added a new layer of tension to the unfolding drama. Meanwhile, Ms. Bernardi, inspired by her conversations with Cleopatra, launched a community project aimed at fostering stronger relationships between longtime residents and new neighbors. Though well-intentioned, her initiatives sometimes led to awkward moments when deep-seated prejudices and misunderstandings surfaced. As these intertwined narratives evolved, the documentation Zafira had collected provided crucial evidence for the police reforms being debated by the city council. Simultaneously, Ms. Bernardi's community group became a forum where the broader implications of Cleopatra's case were examined. For Cleopatra, everything seemed to be building toward a climactic event, one that would force everyone involved to confront their own biases, question their beliefs, and work toward genuine understanding and change within the community. Her courageous act of resistance had set off ripples that continued to spread, reshaping relationships and pushing the entire neighborhood to evolve in unexpected ways. The growing friendship between Cleopatra and Ms. Bernardi transcended their initial roles of victim and accuser. Their afternoon tea sessions on Cleopatra's porch became symbols of reconciliation and personal growth. Ms. Bernardi, eager to understand and make amends, listened intently as Cleopatra shared stories from her life during the civil rights era. "You know, Mildred," Cleopatra said one afternoon, using Ms. Bernardi's first name for the first time, "when I was your age, I never imagined I'd be here, sharing tea with a white neighbor who once called the police on me." Ms. Bernardi's eyes filled with tears. "Cleopatra, I can't express how ashamed I am of what I did, but I'm so grateful for this opportunity to learn and grow." Their evolving friendship did not go unnoticed. Neighbors who had initially distanced themselves began to be drawn to the example these two women set. Little by little, the ice of distrust within the community began to melt. Meanwhile, the relationship between Officer Delgado and Judge Sinclair deepened. What began as a cautious alliance became one of mutual trust. Their secret meetings to discuss evidence of police misconduct were filled with tension and shared respect. During one of these meetings in a secluded corner of a local park, Zafira confided her fears to him. "Judge Sinclair, if I make this information public, my career will be over. But if I don't, how will I be able to live with myself?" Orion, grappling with his own ethical dilemma, responded, "Zafira, the path of integrity is never easy, but it is always the right one." Their shared commitment to justice, despite the great personal cost, forged a bond that went beyond their professional roles. Cleopatra's relationship with her son Orion also evolved. They had always been close, but now they saw each other as partners in a cause greater than themselves. Orion began to see his mother not just as a beloved mother, but as a leader and activist. One night, as Orion was walking, Orion was looking at his mother as a loving, caring. They stood together on the porch, Orion taking his mother's hand. "Mom, I've always been proud of you," he said softly. "But what you're doing now, it's something I never imagined." Cleopatra squeezed his hand, her eyes shining. "Well, son, where do you think you got your sense of justice? It sure wasn't from those law books of yours." They both laughed, the sound warm and genuine, carried on the evening breeze, a testament to the love and respect that had deepened through their shared struggles. Cleopatra's relationship with the community at large was also transformed. People who once viewed her as an elderly neighbor now sought her out for her wisdom and moral leadership. Young activists sought her advice, while longtime residents marveled at the energy she still possessed. During a community meeting at the local church, a young African-American man stood up, his voice heavy with emotion. "Ma'am, watching you stand up to those officers and hearing your story has given me hope that change is possible." Cleopatra's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the diverse crowd, all of them looking at her with respect and admiration. In that moment, she realized that her personal fight for justice had become a catalyst for community growth and healing. But not all relationships thrived. Officer Delgado's connection with her colleagues deteriorated as she continued to secretly collect evidence of misconduct. Increasingly isolated, Zafira was viewed with suspicion by those who saw her actions as a betrayal of the unwritten code of police solidarity. At the same time, Orion's relationship with some of her fellow judges became strained. As the controversy surrounding Cleopatra's case intensified, invitations to informal lunches and social events dwindled, replaced by formal greetings in the courtroom hallways. Despite these tensions, even the most fractured relationships reflected deeper issues that needed to be addressed for true reconciliation to occur. Each interaction, whether it brought people together or drove them apart, became a microcosm of the larger struggle for understanding and justice. Cleopatra, observing these shifting dynamics, understood that true change was not just about laws and policies, but about the difficult, ongoing work of building bridges between people. As she gently swayed on her porch, taking in another sunset on this long, grueling journey, she felt a renewed sense of hope. The relationships that had been forged, tested, and transformed throughout this turbulent experience were laying the groundwork for a more just and understanding community. The day of the long-awaited town hall meeting finally arrived, bringing with it palpable tension that reverberated through the packed community center. What had begun as a local incident had become the epicenter of discussions about racial justice, police reform, and community relations. The large auditorium was packed with residents from all walks of life, local officials, community leaders, and media representatives. Cleopatra sat in the front row, her posture dignified and her gaze steady. Beside her were Orion, Ms. Bernati, and a host of other allies who had been with her on this journey. Across the room, the police chief and several officers, including Zafira Delgado, took their seats. The atmosphere was charged with unspoken anticipation and tension as the mayor opened the meeting. "We are here today," he began, his voice echoing in the room, "to address the incident involving Ms. Sinclair and to confront the deeper issues this incident has brought to light in our community." The meeting began quietly, with different community leaders voicing their perspectives. But when the floor was opened for public comment, the latent divisions in the room rose to the surface. Voices rose in anger. "The police were just doing their job," a man shouted, his face rigid with indignation. "We can't tie their hands when they're trying to keep us safe." "And what about our safety?" A young African-American woman replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Who protects us from those who are supposed to?" The tension in the room quickly rose. Years of pent-up frustration, fear, and distrust erupted as community members and police advocates began shouting at each other. The mayor struggled to maintain order, but the situation was spiraling out of control. Suddenly, Officer Zafira Delgado stood up, her face pale but determined. "I have something to say," she exclaimed, her voice cutting through the chaos. The room was... She stood silently as all eyes turned to her. With shaking hands, Zafira approached the podium and pulled a thick folder from her pocket. "For months," she began, her voice steadying, "I have been documenting instances of racial profiling and misconduct within our department. What happened to Ms. Sinclair was not an isolated incident. It is part of a pattern, and it must stop." Chaos erupted once again. Zafira's fellow officers stared at her with a mix of shock and betrayal, while the police chief sat visibly shaken, struggling to find words. Among the community members, some cheered her for her bravery, while others accused her of betraying her badge. At that crucial moment, Cleopatra stood up. Despite her age, her presence dominated the room as she made her way to the podium. Zafira stepped aside, and Cleopatra took her place. The weight of the moment was palpable as she addressed the room, her voice clear and firm. "Look at what we are doing to each other," Cleopatra said, her tone both stern and compassionate. "This anger, this fear, is exactly why we need change. But we will not achieve it by yelling at each other or by casting blame." As Cleopatra spoke, her words seemed to pierce the hearts of those present. Slowly, the fury and fear that filled the room began to dissipate, replaced by a shared understanding of the common humanity that united them. "We have a choice," Cleopatra continued, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "We can let this moment divide us further, or we can use it to unite, to listen, to understand, to work toward real, lasting change. The road ahead will not be easy, but nothing worthwhile is." Her words hung in the air, a call to action that left the room in reverent silence. The community was at a tipping point. The truth had been revealed, the problems exposed. Now, the question remained: could they seize this moment to begin the difficult process of healing and transformation, or would the divisions be too deep to overcome? In the days following the stormy town hall meeting, Cleopatra found herself at the forefront of a massive community effort to address the deep-rooted problems that had come to light. The energy in the village was palpable. Debates, passionate conversations, and endless meetings filled the air as various groups struggled to find a way forward. The realization that the path to justice required not only institutional reforms, but also a reimagining of community relations set the tone for the work to come. Recognizing the need for a more structured approach to conflict resolution, community leaders, inspired by Cleopatra's unwavering determination, began organizing. Each small step, each conversation, brought the neighborhood closer to a shared vision of what their community could be. A place where justice was not just a lofty ideal, but a lived reality for all. Cleopatra, along with Orion, Zafira Delgado, and other community leaders, organized a series of smaller, focused meetings. They realized that while the public forum had been powerful, it overwhelmed many, preventing meaningful dialogue. These more intimate meetings allowed for closer conversations, where people felt safer to express their true feelings and experiences. At one such meeting, a diverse group of residents gathered, including longtime community members, new homeowners, and local business owners. The tension was palpable as Cleopatra opened the discussion. "We are here today," she began softly but firmly, "not to point fingers, but to listen to and understand one another. Every person in this room has valid experiences and concerns. Our task is to find a way forward." As the conversation progressed, it became clear that the problems went beyond police practices or racial profiling. Residents expressed feeling disconnected from their rapidly changing world, worried about safety and property values, and struggling with cultural barriers. An older man, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, stood up to speak. "I've lived here for 40 years, he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Sometimes I feel like I don't recognize my own neighborhood anymore. It's not about race. It's that I feel like I'm a stranger in my own home." A young African-American woman responded, her voice shaking. "We too feel like strangers in a place that should be our home. Do you understand what it feels like to be seen as a threat just for existing in your own community?" D. These raw, honest words were painful to hear, but necessary. Cleopatra and her team worked tirelessly to create a space where all voices were heard and acknowledged. They gently encouraged participants to consider viewpoints beyond their own. Alongside these community discussions, Cleopatra worked closely with Orion and Zafira to address internal issues within the police department. They organized meetings between community members and police officers, facilitated by professional mediators. Though fraught with emotion and tension, these meetings provided a crucial opportunity for both sides to begin seeing each other as human beings, not enemies. In one particularly powerful session, a young African-American man shared his experience of being repeatedly stopped and questioned by police. "I feel like I'm seen as a criminal just for walking down the street," he said, his voice breaking. A veteran officer, visibly moved, responded, "I never realized how we were perceived. These actions train us to be vigilant, but I now see that enforcing the law without understanding can feel like prejudice." These moments of connection, though small, were critical steps in the conflict resolution process. Cleopatra understood that true change would take time, but each small step represented progress in the right direction. As part of their efforts, Cleopatra and her team worked with local authorities to implement tangible changes. They promoted greater transparency in police practices, advocated for the creation of community oversight boards, and helped develop training programs for officers focused on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. However, the road to resolution was not easy. There were setbacks and moments of high tension that threatened to undo progress. A police shooting in a neighboring city reignited tensions, leading to protests and demands for more immediate action. In response to these challenges, Cleopatra organized a neighborhood peace walk. Unlike a protest, this event was designed to bring people together in a spirit of humility and shared purpose. Residents of all races and backgrounds walked side by side, many holding hands or chatting with neighbors they had never spoken to before. As the weeks and months passed, the effects of their conflict resolution efforts became apparent. Reported incidents of racial profiling decreased, while community satisfaction with local law enforcement began to increase. The Community Oversight Board, after initial adjustments, proved to be a tool for transparency and accountability. Cleopatra's approach to conflict resolution, which prioritized listening, understanding, and finding common ground, began to influence other aspects of community life. Neighborhood associations adopted similar methods to address local problems, and schools implemented programs that taught students about diversity and conflict resolution. However, Cleopatra and her team also had to accept that not all conflicts could be fully resolved. Some wounds were too deep and certain disagreements too fundamental to be easily reconciled. They learned to measure success not by total harmony, but by creating spaces where difficult conversations could be had in a respectful and productive manner. As conflict resolution efforts continued, Cleopatra found herself reflecting on the words of Martin Luther King Jr., with whom she had marched in her youth. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." She understood that her work was part of that long arc, and that each small step forward contributed to the larger journey toward a more just and equal society. Although the journey was far from over, Cleopatra felt a growing sense of hope. She knew that by addressing these conflicts, they were contributing to collective progress. In the midst of the challenges, Cleopatra and her team realized that they were not only solving immediate problems, but were also laying the groundwork for a more united and understanding community in the years to come. Months of intense community discussions, policy changes, and personal growth marked a significant turning point for both Cleopatra and her neighborhood. What had begun as a terrifying confrontation on her own porch had become a movement for change, touching every aspect of life. This transformation brought with it new challenges and opportunities, opening a new chapter for Cleopatra and her allies. One evening, as Cleopatra was reflecting on her porch, considering all the progress they had made, an unexpected call interrupted her thoughts. It was the mayor of a nearby town, who had heard about the transformative work being done in Cleopatra's community. He wanted to know if she would be willing to share her experiences and strategies with other communities facing similar struggles. This opportunity presented Cleopatra with a crucial decision: to share her story on a broader platform, potentially impacting lives far beyond what she had imagined. But it also meant exposing herself more to the public eye and taking on responsibilities that seemed overwhelming for someone her age. After careful reflection and long conversations with Oren, Zafira, and other close allies, Cleopatra made a momentous decision. She would accept the invitation. She saw it as an opportunity to expand the impact of her work beyond her neighborhood. "We have an opportunity," Cleopatra explained to her support group, which included Oron, Zafira, and Ms. Bernati. "What we have started in our community could be the beginning of a much larger movement to improve police-community relations across the country." The group was motivated by the idea, but they also recognized the challenges ahead. Scaling up their efforts would require resources, organization, and a willingness to engage with communities that might be even more resistant to change than their own. With the unwavering support of their allies, Cleopatra began outlining a plan for a new initiative. Their mission would be to provide resources, training, and support to communities facing racial bias in policing, and to improve relations between law enforcement and citizens. They called the initiative Bridges of Understanding. It would bring together community leaders, police officers, and social justice advocates, offering a comprehensive approach to systemic reform based on lessons learned from their own experiences. As word of this new initiative spread, a renewed sense of purpose swept through the community. Many who had been active in local efforts were eager to contribute to a larger cause. Local businesses offered their support, schools incorporated conflict resolution techniques into their curricula, and even some police officers, inspired by Zafira's example, volunteered to share their experiences with other departments. This new approach was not without its difficulties, however. Some community members feared that focusing on national issues might downplay local efforts still underway, while others were concerned about the increased scrutiny that a higher profile would bring. Despite these concerns, Cleopatra was confident that they were on the right path. Standing in front of the newly rented space that would serve as the headquarters for Bridges of Understanding, she felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. The journey that had begun with a confrontation on her porch had led her to this moment, the start of a movement that had the potential to impact communities across the country. The tipping point had arrived, bringing with it a new direction, not just for Cleopatra, but for all who had been a part of this transformative experience. As she took her first steps into the office, Cleopatra knew the real work was just beginning. In the months following the launch of Bridges of Understanding, Cleopatra often reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The woman she saw in the mirror was both familiar and different, the same face that had endured nearly 8 decades of life, but now with a luminosity born of renewed purpose and greater understanding. Cleopatra realized she had developed a strength she didn't know existed. Even after years of facing adversity, confrontation with the police, unrest in her community, and the challenges of leading a national initiative had tested her limits. Yet she had embraced public scrutiny, grappled with complex social issues, and taken on the responsibility of being a voice for change. Through it all, Cleopatra had emerged from the experience stronger and more committed than ever. Her vision for social and community change had evolved significantly. Although he had always believed in the power of individual action, he now understood how a single incident could ignite a spark capable of starting a movement, and how personal stories could drive profound transformations. He understood more deeply in Ellie the importance of building bridges, creating space for difficult conversations, and using empathy to overcome deeply held biases. Perhaps Cleopatra's greatest growth came in her role as a leader. Once a quiet presence in her community, content to stay in the background, she now found herself thrust into the public spotlight as a prominent voice for change in police-community relations. She learned to navigate media interviews, speak powerfully in front of diverse audiences, and bridge gaps between groups with differing interests and perspectives. However, this new public role brought its own set of challenges. Cleopatra often felt the weight of responsibility, knowing that her words and actions could have far-reaching repercussions in communities across the country. There were moments of doubt, times when she wondered if she was really the right person to lead such a movement. But in those moments, she remembered the words she had said to Oron that fateful day. "It's time for a change, and if I have to be the one to initiate it, so be it." Cleopatra was also reflecting on how her relationships had evolved. Her bond with Oron had deepened, as mother and son became partners in a shared mission, forging unexpected alliances. One of those alliances was her friendship with Mrs. Bernati, a powerful example of the change they were working to promote. Even her relationship with Zafira Delgado had transformed, becoming a testament to the possibility of growth and redemption within law enforcement. As she prepared for another day filled with meetings, interviews, and strategy sessions, Cleopatra felt a deep sense of gratitude. Despite the many challenges she faced, the incident that had set it all in motion had stripped away any sense of complacency, forcing her to confront difficult truths about society and herself. This transformative journey had led to personal and collective growth. Cleopatra Sinclair, the elderly woman once harassed on her own porch, had become so much more: an advocate, a community leader, and a symbol of resilience and change. As she looked to the future, Cleopatra felt prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Armed with a newfound wisdom and conviction, she was more ready than ever to continue fighting for justice, knowing that the road ahead would be long, but that she would walk it with purpose. With a deep breath and a determined smile, Cleopatra set out to face another day, working for the change she so longed to see in the world, the growth she had witnessed both personally and in her community. A framed photograph sat nearby, capturing the moment she was surrounded by her core team of support: Orion, Zafira, and Mrs. Bernati, a constant reminder of the journey she had taken and the allies who had stood by her side. Every challenge she faced and every community she touched represented another opportunity to keep moving forward. Cleopatra knew that each step contributed to building a more just and equitable society. What had begun as a moment of injustice on her own porch had, over time, expanded into something much larger. As she stood in front of the podium, ready to deliver the keynote address at the National Conference on Community Policing and Racial Equity, Cleopatra took a moment to absorb the sight of the diverse audience before her. Police officers, community activists, policymakers, and citizens from across the country had gathered, drawn by the promise of a renewed approach to addressing the deep-rooted problems of racial bias and police-community relations. This moment, she realized, represented the culmination of a journey that had begun with a terrifying confrontation and had evolved into a powerful movement for change. Cleopatra began her speech by weaving together lessons learned from her experiences: resistance to injustice, the power of community to drive transformation, the importance of open dialogue, and the potential for personal growth to spark social change. She shared stories from her community, highlighting the journeys of Zafira, Ms. Bernati, and others who had faced uncomfortable truths, and, in doing so, sparked powerful change. Our journey toward justice and equity is far from over, Cleopatra concluded in a firm and determined voice. But what we have learned is that change begins with each of us, confronting our own biases, listening to experiences different from our own, and working together toward a common goal. Each of us is united in our own vision of change. Conversation: every policy change and every moment of understanding is a step toward the society we aspire to build. The applause that followed was not just an endorsement of her words. It was a collective affirmation of a new vision for police-community relations and social justice. As Cleopatra stepped down from the podium, she felt a profound mix of closure and a new beginning. What had begun on her porch had culminated in this transformative moment, not just for her, but for communities across the country. In the audience's inspired applause and cheers, Cleopatra glimpsed the promise of a future where justice, understanding, and equality would no longer be just ideals, but tangible realities. It was a future she was now helping to build, step by step, conversation by conversation, mind by transformed mind.